The history of Vietnam in the 20th century is a story of resistance, ambition, and the collision of ideologies that would reshape a nation and challenge a superpower. But before America ever became entangled in Southeast Asia, this was a struggle born from colonialism and the hunger for independence. For nearly 7 decades, Vietnam existed under French colonial rule. French administrators, soldiers, and merchants had established themselves across the region, extracting resources and imposing European governance on a people with their own rich history and traditions. But by the middle of the 20th century, a movement for independence was gathering momentum. Leading this movement was a figure who would become one of America's greatest adversaries, a thin man with a wispy beard named Ho Chi Minh. Before Ho Chi Minh became a symbol of communist revolution, he was a wanderer. He worked across continents in humble positions, as a dishwasher, as a photo retoucher, as a pastry cook. But his travels gave him something invaluable, a vision of liberation. In 1945, when Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnamese independence, he did something remarkable. He opened his declaration with words from the American Constitution. All men are created equal. He borrowed from Thomas Jefferson, the founding father of the nation that would one day become his enemy. Ho Chi Minh believed that the ideals of democracy and self-determination were universal. France, however, rejected this declaration. Rather than acknowledge Vietnamese independence, the French military mobilized to reclaim their colonial possession. What followed was a bitter war between France and the Vietnamese independence movement, led by the Viet Minh. At the heart of the Viet Minh's military strategy stood General Vo Nguyen Giap. Giap's background was unconventional for a military commander. He was a history teacher who had learnt the art of warfare not through formal military academy training, but through studying the campaigns of Napoleon between his classes. Yet this education served him well. Giap understood something fundamental about asymmetrical warfare. Victory does not always come through defeating an enemy in traditional battle. Sometimes victory comes through outlasting them, through wearing down their resolve until they lose the will to continue fighting. In May 1954, this strategy reached its dramatic climax at a French fortress called Dien Bien Phu. Giap's soldiers undertook an extraordinary feat of logistics and determination. They hauled heavy artillery pieces up steep jungle mountains, piece by piece, assembling them piece by piece around the fortified position. For 56 days, they bombarded the French garrison from elevated positions. Finally, France surrendered. The fortress fell, and with it, France's entire colonial enterprise in Vietnam crumbled. The international community responded to this seismic event by convening the Geneva Conference in 1954. The assembled diplomats faced a critical question. What would become of Vietnam? The agreement that emerged was meant to be temporary. Vietnam would be divided at the 17th parallel. North Vietnam, governed by Ho Chi Minh and supported by the communist powers, China and the Soviet Union, would comprise the northern half. South Vietnam, led by President Ngo Dinh Diem and backed by the United States, would comprise the south. According to the Geneva Accords, nationwide elections would be held within 2 years to reunify the country and determine its political future. But those elections never came to pass. In the years following the Geneva Conference, the United States became increasingly committed to supporting South Vietnam. Washington was gripped by what became known as the domino theory, the conviction that if one nation fell under communist control, its neighbors would inevitably follow, like dominoes arranged in a line. This theory shaped American foreign policy throughout the Cold War. From the perspective of American policymakers, allowing South Vietnam to fall to communism was unthinkable. It would represent not just a strategic defeat, but a fundamental failure in the global struggle against communist expansion. To prevent this outcome, the United States poured enormous resources into South Vietnam. Money flowed in to support the government. Modern weapons arrived to equip Diem's army, and American military advisors came to train South Vietnamese forces in modern warfare tactics. The American commitment deepened steadily through the 1950s and early 1960s, though it remained officially limited to an advisory role. President Ngo Dinh Diem, however, proved to be a deeply problematic ally. He governed through authoritarianism and repression. He rigged elections to maintain power. He imprisoned political opponents and critics. And in a nation where Buddhism was practiced by the majority of the population, Diem's government systematically persecuted Buddhist monks and communities, favoring the Catholic minority to which Diem himself belonged. By 1963, Buddhist opposition to Diem's rule had reached a breaking point. In June of that year, in an act of profound protest, a Buddhist monk named Thich Quang Duc sat down at a busy intersection in Saigon. Before the eyes of gathering crowds and international photographers, he set himself ablaze. The image of his burning body, transmitted around the world, shocked global audiences and exposed the brutality of Diem's regime. The photograph of Thich Quang Duc's self-immolation represented a turning point. American policymakers realized that Diem had become a liability. On November 2, 1963, South Vietnamese generals, with tacit approval from Washington, moved against Diem. They launched a coup d'état. Diem was captured and executed. Just 3 weeks later, on November 23, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. The responsibility for Vietnam and the choice between escalation or withdrawal fell to the new president, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Johnson inherited a deteriorating situation in Southeast Asia. He was reluctant to commit America to a large-scale war in Vietnam, but he also feared the political consequences of losing Vietnam to communism. He faced an impossible choice: withdraw and accept what he believed would be a humiliating communist victory, or escalate American military involvement and risk drawing the nation into a prolonged jungle war thousands of miles from American shores. In August 1964, events moved to resolve this dilemma, though the true nature of these events remains controversial to this day. In the Gulf of Tonkin, off the coast of North Vietnam, an American naval destroyer called the USS Maddox reported that it had been attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. 2 nights later, the Maddox reported a second attack. Radar screens displayed blips. Sonar systems issued warnings. Gunners aboard the ship fired into the darkness, convinced they were under assault. But there is strong evidence that the second attack never actually occurred. What the American crews experienced was likely a combination of equipment malfunction, freak weather patterns, and the heightened anxiety of troops prepared for combat. The evidence of a genuine second attack was thin then, and historians have since thoroughly questioned whether it happened at all. Nonetheless, within days, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This legislation granted President Johnson the authority to wage war in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war from Congress. The House of Representatives voted unanimously in favor of the measure. America had essentially handed the president a blank check for military escalation. In March 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder commenced. For the next 3 years, American aircraft would rain bombs on North Vietnam in an unprecedented bombing campaign. The objectives were ambitious: to destroy North Vietnam's industrial capacity, to disrupt the flow of supplies heading south, and to break the will of North Vietnamese leaders. Just days after the bombing campaign began, The first major American ground forces arrived in South Vietnam. On March 8, 1965, 3,500 Marines of the 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines, waded ashore at Da Nang. They came prepared for combat, equipped with rifles and ammunition, trained for urban warfare and jungle operations. The troops expected resistance, anticipated firefights, and steeled themselves for casualties. Instead, they were met by smiling Vietnamese civilians, many of them young women and girls. These civilians approached the Marines bearing garlands of flowers, which they placed around the soldiers' necks in gestures of welcome. The incongruity was striking. Soldiers prepared for battle, greeting instead with flowers and smiles. Commanding the overall American war effort was General William Westmoreland. Westmoreland embodied the image of the traditional American military leader, a strong-jawed officer whose chest was covered with military decorations, a former first captain at the United States Military Academy at West Point. He looked, as observers noted, almost as if he had been designed to play the role of the ideal American soldier. Westmoreland's strategy was straightforward in its logic, though horrific in its execution. He believed that the United States, with its technological superiority, its vast industrial capacity, and its sophisticated weaponry, could defeat North Vietnam through a strategy of attrition. In November 1965, this strategy was tested in the Ia Drang Valley. American intelligence had detected several thousand North Vietnamese soldiers massing in the area, but the terrain offered no conventional approach. The jungle was dense, the mountains steep, and no roads led to the region. So the American military deployed its newest and most innovative weapon, the helicopter. Troops called it the Huey. Wave after wave of Huey helicopters descended into a clearing designated Landing Zone X-ray, depositing approximately 450 men of the 7th Cavalry, led by Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore. As the helicopters lifted away, Moore's men secured the landing zone, but they did not know that their landing zone was adjacent to a mountain ridge that concealed more than 2,000 North Vietnamese soldiers. The Americans had landed in a location of catastrophic vulnerability. For 3 days, the battle raged. Moore's numerically inferior force fought for survival in progressively tighter defensive positions. The North Vietnamese commanders ordered their troops to grab the Americans by the belt buckle, to close the distance so quickly and hold positions so tightly that American artillery support could not be used without risking friendly casualties. The American perimeter contracted steadily as casualties mounted. At the critical moment, when the American line appeared on the verge of collapse, an Air Force forward air controller radioed 2 words that signaled the desperation of the situation: broken arrow. This meant the American force was in danger of being overrun. Every available aircraft in Vietnam, the message implied, should converge on the location and deliver their ordnance. Minutes later, the sky above Landing Zone X-ray erupted with American firepower. Fighter jets screamed overhead, releasing their ordnance. Bombers dropped their loads. The North Vietnamese positions, suddenly subjected to overwhelming aerial bombardment, began to crumble. The enemy soldiers retreated into the jungle. But the campaign was not finished. Days later, a sister battalion of the 7th Cavalry was ambushed in the grass. The enemy had learned quickly, and this unit was torn apart by coordinated North Vietnamese attacks. When the dust settled, American casualties stood at approximately 300 killed, with over 1,000 wounded. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong casualties were estimated at over 1,000 killed. In the immediate aftermath, both sides claimed victory. American commanders saw the battle as evidence of the effectiveness of their strategy. Overwhelming firepower had prevailed. North Vietnamese commanders drew a different lesson. American soldiers could be killed in large numbers, and the solution lay in developing tactics that could neutralize American technological advantages. This divergence of interpretation would echo through the remainder of the war. As American troop deployments expanded, reaching a peak of nearly 500,000 by 1967, the character of the war became increasingly clear. This was unlike any conflict the United States had previously fought. There were no front lines, no geographic objective to capture, no enemy capital to seize. Instead, American soldiers, many of them just 19 or 20 years old, were sent on search and destroy missions into an environment where every element seemed designed to confound and destroy them. They operated in oppressive heat and humidity, hacking through dense jungle with machetes, wading through rice paddies where leeches attached to their legs, traversing villages where it was impossible to distinguish combatants from civilians. The Viet Cong, the communist guerrilla force operating within South Vietnam, were everywhere and nowhere. They blended into the civilian population, emerged from hidden tunnels to strike, and vanished back underground before American forces could respond. The tunnel systems beneath the Cu Chi district were particularly extraordinary. The Viet Cong had excavated over 150 miles of underground passages, entire subterranean cities where fighters slept, ate, planned operations, and cared for the wounded. These tunnels were booby-trapped with explosive devices. Trapdoors led to underground chambers where soldiers waited to ambush unsuspecting Americans. As American soldiers struggled against these asymmetrical tactics, the military escalated its response. Herbicides, particularly the chemical compound known as Agent Orange, were sprayed across vast areas of South Vietnam. The intention was to defoliate the jungle, removing the vegetation that provided concealment for the Viet Cong. Between 1962 and 1970, the American military sprayed approximately 20 million gallons of herbicides over Vietnam. The consequences of this decision would persist for decades, causing health problems in both the American veteran population and the Vietnamese civilian population. Meanwhile, North Vietnam's supply line, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, operated continuously. This network of hidden paths, roads and rivers wound through neighboring Laos and Cambodia, territories that American ground forces were prohibited from entering due to political considerations. Supplies, weapons, ammunition, food, clothing flowed south along this trail, transported on trucks, in boats, and even by bicycle. American planes bombed the Ho Chi Minh Trail around the clock. Sorties were flown daily. Craters appeared in the earth where ordnance had struck. Yet each morning, North Vietnamese workers and soldiers emerged to fill the craters, repair damaged sections, and keep the supplies moving. It was, in effect, a military campaign fought against the laws of logistics itself. Back in the United States, the war became increasingly unpopular. The draft, the mechanism by which the military conscripted young men into service, became a flashpoint of social conflict. Young men burned their draft cards in public acts of protest. College campuses erupted in demonstrations against the war. Families were divided between those who supported the war effort and those who opposed it. The cohesion of American society began to fracture. By late 1967, American citizens were asking a fundamental question: were they actually winning? General Westmoreland, sensing that American public opinion was wavering, flew back to the United States and delivered speeches assuring the American people that the end was in sight. Light at the end of the tunnel. Victory was approaching. The enemy was weakening. 2 months later, that supposed light revealed itself to be an oncoming train. January 30, 1968 was Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year. For decades, both the North and South had honored a ceasefire during this sacred holiday period. Soldiers went home to their families. Civilians traveled to reunite with loved ones. Fireworks illuminated the skies. It was a moment of truce. General Vo Nguyen Yap, still commanding North Vietnamese forces, made a strategic calculation. The Americans would not be expecting an offensive during Tet. The South Vietnamese military would be at reduced readiness. American planes and artillery might hesitate to fire, concerned about civilian casualties during the holiday. It was the perfect moment to strike. In a coordinated military operation of extraordinary ambition, approximately 80,000 communist soldiers launched simultaneous attacks on more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam. The assault was comprehensive and devastating. From the perspective of military strategy, it was a disaster for the North. The Viet Cong, the indigenous communist guerrilla force, was shattered in the offensive. No single city remained in communist hands after the initial assault. American and South Vietnamese military forces, once they had recovered from the shock of the coordinated offensive, inflicted catastrophic casualties on the attackers. But Tet was not designed to win territory. It was designed to win hearts and minds, specifically the hearts and minds of the American people. For 3 years, the American government had promised that the war was being won. Then, on television news broadcasts that reached into every American living room, the biggest offensive of the entire war unfolded. If the war was being won, how could the enemy launch such an offensive? Walter Cronkite, the most trusted news anchor in America, flew to Vietnam in the aftermath of Tet. He surveyed the damage, interviewed soldiers and officials, and returned to America with a message. The war was mired in stalemate. There was no clear path to victory. President Johnson, watching Cronkite's broadcast, understood the significance. If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America. On March 31, 1968, just 2 months after Tet, President Johnson addressed the American nation in a televised speech. He announced that he would not seek re-election. The war had broken his presidency. He would not run for a second term. But 1968 held one more dark chapter, one that would sear itself into the American conscience. On the morning of March 16, 1968, soldiers of Charlie Company were transported by helicopter into a small village called My Lai in Quang Ngai Province. They had been informed that the village was a Viet Cong stronghold filled with enemy fighters. After weeks of losing comrades to mines and booby traps, emotions ran high. The troops came looking for revenge. But My Lai contained no Viet Cong fighters that morning. It held only civilians, women, children, and elderly people preparing breakfast for their families. Over the course of approximately 4 hours, the soldiers of Charlie Company, led by 2nd Lieutenant William Calley, carried out a massacre. Approximately 500 unarmed civilians were killed. Not a single shot was fired back. Families were separated and executed. Children were murdered. The violence was systematic and methodical. Overhead, observing from a scout helicopter, was Chief Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, just 24 years old. Thompson watched in growing horror as he realized what was occurring on the ground below. He saw bodies strewn throughout the village. He saw American soldiers attacking civilians. Then he spotted a group of terrified villagers running toward a concrete bunker, with American troops pursuing them, weapons drawn, clearly intending to kill them. Thompson made an extraordinary decision. He landed his helicopter directly between the American soldiers and the Vietnamese civilians. He ordered his 2 crew members to train their door guns on the American infantry. If the soldiers attempted to harm the civilians, Thompson instructed his crew they should fire. Thompson was threatening his own countrymen to protect Vietnamese civilians. Using his helicopter, Thompson evacuated the villagers to safety. He immediately reported the incident to his superiors. But the American military did not want this story to become public. The massacre was covered up. Army investigators were discouraged from pursuing the matter too vigorously. It was not until more than a year later, when journalists broke the story publicly, that Americans learned what had occurred at My Lai. The revelation shattered something fundamental in the American self-image. My Lai represented a moral catastrophe, a violation of the principles that Americans believed their military stood for. Hugh Thompson, meanwhile, was initially condemned by fellow soldiers for his actions. It took 30 years, until 1998, before Thompson and his crew received official recognition for their heroism, for standing against their own side to protect innocent civilians. In November 1968, Richard Nixon was elected president on a promise of peace with honor. His plan for ending the war was called Vietnamization. The strategy was conceptually simple: gradually transfer military responsibility to South Vietnamese forces while systematically withdrawing American troops. American soldiers would come home, and South Vietnamese soldiers would assume the burden of defending their nation. But Nixon's approach to Vietnam would involve one more escalation before the war could begin to wind down. In 1970, Nixon authorized the invasion of Cambodia, a neutral country, to disrupt North Vietnamese sanctuaries and supply lines in that nation. This expansion of the war sparked an eruption of protest across American college campuses. At Kent State University in Ohio, on May 4, 1970, National Guard troops opened fire on student protesters. 4 young Americans were killed on their own campus. The nation was no longer merely divided about the Vietnam War. It appeared to be tearing itself apart. That same year, a series of classified documents known as the Pentagon Papers was leaked to journalists. These documents, which had been prepared within the Department of Defense, revealed uncomfortable truths. Successive American presidents, going back to the Eisenhower administration, had harbored serious doubts about the possibility of winning the war in Vietnam. The American leadership had known the war might be unwinnable, yet had continued to escalate American involvement. While the war raged in the jungles and cities of Southeast Asia, hundreds of American military personnel, pilots shot down over North Vietnam, soldiers captured during ground operations, languished in North Vietnamese prison camps. The conditions in these camps were brutal. Torture was systematic. Starvation was endemic. Isolation was psychological warfare. The most infamous of these camps was the Hanoi Hilton, a former French colonial prison that had become a symbol of the brutal captivity endured by American prisoners of war. For years, these men suffered unspeakable torment. In one remarkable act of resistance, a prisoner of war who was forced to participate in a propaganda film blinked his eyes in Morse code while speaking to the camera. He spelled out a single word, over and over, for those who might understand the coded message: Torture. While his captors believed they were capturing propaganda footage, this prisoner was in fact testifying to the abuse being inflicted upon him. He was communicating the truth to the outside world through a code only those who understood Morse would comprehend. By 1972, the North Vietnamese leadership sensed that American resolve was cracking. American troops were withdrawing. American public opinion had turned decisively against the war. The time seemed right for a final military offensive. In the spring of 1972, North Vietnam launched the Easter Offensive, a full-scale invasion of the South Vietnam designed to achieve military victory before American withdrawal was complete. The South Vietnamese military, with some American support, managed to repel this invasion. But the situation remained precarious. South Vietnam would need continued American military support to survive. Recognizing that he needed to achieve a negotiated settlement, President Nixon took a dramatic step. When peace negotiations stalled in December 1972, Nixon authorized the most intensive bombing campaign of the entire war. For 11 consecutive days, waves of B-52 bombers, the largest bombers in the American arsenal, hammered North Vietnamese targets, particularly Hanoi itself. The bombing campaign, known as the Christmas bombing, was devastating in its scope and intensity. These 11 days of intense bombardment accomplished what years of negotiation had not. North Vietnamese leadership, recognizing that continued resistance would exact an unbearable cost, returned to the negotiating table with genuine intention to reach a settlement. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The agreement provided for a ceasefire and the withdrawal of American military forces from Vietnam. American combat troops would leave. American prisoners of war would be released and repatriated. 2 months after the Paris Peace Accords were signed, the last American combat troops departed Vietnam. When the aircraft carrying these final American soldiers arrived at American bases, a scene of profound emotion unfolded. Families who had been separated from their sons, husbands, and brothers for years were reunited. Prisoners of war who had endured years of captivity walked off aircraft into the embrace of loved ones. But the Paris Peace Accords had not ended the war between North and South Vietnam. It had merely ended America's direct military participation in that war. The two Vietnamese nations remained locked in opposition, both preparing for renewed conflict. For 2 years after American withdrawal, South Vietnam fought alone against the North, but in March 1975, North Vietnam launched its final offensive. South Vietnamese defenses, which had been weakened by reduced American military support and by internal corruption and demoralization, crumbled rapidly. Cities fell in succession. Military units dissolved into chaos. What North Vietnamese military planners believed would take 2 years, the conquest of South Vietnam, took only 55 days. By late April 1975, North Vietnamese forces surrounded Saigon, the capital and largest city of South Vietnam. The collapse was imminent. On April 29th, American military commanders made the decision that all remaining American personnel and as many South Vietnamese and third country nationals as possible would be evacuated. The signal for evacuation was cryptic. Over American radio broadcasts in Saigon, listeners heard an unusual message: "It's 105 degrees in Saigon and rising," followed by a recording of Bing Crosby singing White Christmas. Those who understood the code knew evacuation was beginning immediately. What followed was Operation Frequent Wind, the largest helicopter evacuation in history. For nearly 24 consecutive hours, American helicopters flew from various locations in Saigon, rooftops of buildings, the grounds of the American embassy, to Navy ships positioned in the South China Sea. The scenes were chaotic. Thousands of South Vietnamese, desperate to escape the advancing North Vietnamese forces, surged forward seeking space on the helicopters. Marines guarding the embassy compound struggled to maintain order as terrified people pressed against the perimeter. At sea, the situation was equally desperate. Helicopters arrived at American aircraft carriers faster than crews could unload them. To create space for additional arriving helicopters carrying evacuees, sailors made the agonizing decision to push helicopters over the sides of the ships into the ocean, destroying the aircraft to make room for more refugees. In a single day, approximately 7,000 people were evacuated from Saigon. This included the American ambassador, who left carrying the American embassy flag folded beneath his arm. As dawn broke on April 30, 1975, 11 American Marines stood alone on the embassy rooftop. They were the last Americans in Saigon. A final helicopter descended through the smoke and dust to retrieve them. As the helicopter lifted away, carrying those final American servicemen toward the sea, the city fell into North Vietnamese hands. Hours after the last Americans departed, a North Vietnamese tank crashed through the gates of the South Vietnamese presidential palace. The war was over. For the first time in its history, the United States had lost a war. The human cost of the Vietnam War was staggering. Approximately 58,220 Americans never returned home. Most were in their 20s or younger, the youngest of America's generation. For Vietnam itself, the death toll was incomprehensibly higher. Between 1 and 3 million North Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, and Cambodian civilians and soldiers died. Entire families were destroyed. Villages were erased from maps. A nation was scarred, physically and psychologically, for generations. Yet, unlike every previous American war, the soldiers who returned home did not receive the gratitude of a grateful nation. Many were ignored by society. Some were blamed for the war itself, as if the young men who had served bore personal responsibility for strategic decisions made by political leaders. But America possesses a remarkable capacity for self-reflection and redemption. In 1982, a memorial was constructed on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., designed by a 21-year-old college student named Maya Lin. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial is a simple structure, a V-shaped wall of black granite, polished to a mirror finish. Inscribed upon its surface are the names of all 58,220 Americans who died in the Vietnam War. Each year, millions of visitors come to the wall. They trace the names with their fingers. They leave letters and photographs and medals. They place flowers at the base. Veterans who survived the war, including former prisoners of war who endured years of torture in Hanoi, have returned to Vietnam as peacemakers, working toward reconciliation between the nations that were once mortal enemies. In 1995, 2 decades after the war's conclusion, the United States and Vietnam officially normalized diplomatic relations and established formal peace. Enemies became partners. This is the Vietnam War, a conflict that divided America, claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, and ultimately resulted in America's first military defeat. But it is also a story of resilience, of a nation's capacity to honor its fallen, to learn from its mistakes, and to pursue reconciliation even in the aftermath of profound tragedy.